Hi everybody. The purpose of this video is for me to talk through the assignment called Interpretive Working Papers, of which you'll do 2 during the course of this quarter. I hope the sound quality of this video is okay. Just as I sat down to make it, my neighbor started playing with his little daughter outside my window, so you may hear sounds of a little girl swinging on a swing, but hopefully it won't be too distracting. Interpretive working papers are kind of an unusual assignment, so some students can find them a little bit intimidating. I hope that's not the case, and I'm going to try to do my best to explain to you exactly what I'm hoping you'll accomplish in this assignment. You'll see on the Canvas page that there are fairly detailed guidelines for the assignment. I think it runs to about 9 pages long, so I'm trying to explain in that document what this assignment is about, and that should be the first source that you consult before even you watch this video. There are also sample papers up on the Canvas page that you can look at for examples of student work that does a good job on this particular assignment. The technical term for what we're trying to do in this assignment is called discourse analysis. And what that means is we're asking students to analyze a particular discourse at various different levels. I've also posted online a couple of chapters, although the relevant one is only chapter 4, from Joel Green's book Seized by Truth, in which he explains a little bit more about the nature of discourse analysis and the categories that are used in this particular assignment. So you can also consult that if the guidelines that I've given and this video don't quite give you enough information. But essentially, what we're trying to do in this assignment, and this is an assignment that many of us use in the Bible department, and especially the New Testament department at Fuller, is to encourage you to think about the various kinds of questions you can ask about a text, or the various ways that you can read a text, or the various angles through which you can approach a text. So in the same way that if you're analyzing a film, you can pay attention to a number of different levels, such as the performance of the actors, or the quality of the direction, or the quality of the sound, or the musical score, or the CGI production, or the marketing of the film, or the way in which the film it relates to earlier films or draws upon earlier films. In the same way you can do all of that, you can also do that when you're analyzing a text. And so this assignment is trying to get you to look at various different kinds of questions that you can ask about a text. You can ask historical questions. You can ask questions that are focused on the structure or even the genre of the text. You can ask questions that look at how the text relates to earlier text or even later text. You can ask theological questions. You can ask ethical questions. You can ask political questions. So there really is, in some ways, no end to the kind of the kinds of questions that you can ask about a text. And what this assignment is doing, of course, in 1,500 words or less, is attempting to encourage you to think about a text at various different levels. Okay, so I hope that makes some sense, perhaps in light of the guidelines that I've given. If anything I say still leaves you mystified, please feel free to post a question in the Q&A. That will be then available for everybody to read, and I'll do my best to answer in a way that is coherent. The other thing to say about this particular assignment is that the grading is staged or sequenced such that the first assignment is worth a smaller percentage of your grade than the second interpretive working paper. And my aim is that you'll get substantive feedback on the first paper that will help you do better on the second paper. And in fact, last year I discovered that this in fact was the case, which I went back and looked at in my classes 5 years of data, comparing student scores on the first interpretive working paper versus the second. And I can't remember the exact number, but there was something like a 5-point difference, a 5-point improvement on average. That doesn't necessarily mean everybody improves, but it does mean that in general, what I'm trying to do in this assignment is give you critical feedback on the first version, which is worth less of your overall grade, so that you improve on the second. And the more you sort of do this, the more you get the hang of it. If you've had a class in what we call BI 500, Interpretive Practices here at Fuller, which is a required class for, I think, almost all master's degrees, you will have done an assignment like this. And if you're yet to take BI 500, you will do an assignment like this probably. There might be some variation, but essentially BI 500 typically often uses something like this. So all that to say, it is a little bit of an unusual kind of assignment because it's not exactly like a research paper. I sometimes say it's kind of like a cross between study notes that you would take if you were preparing to preach a sermon or lead a Bible study on a passage, and a formal research paper. So you're not advancing a thesis. You're making a set of observations based on a number of different criteria, okay? Or categories, I should say. So let me just talk through then what those categories are and try to explain what I'm looking for. You'll see on the guidelines, which I'll be referring to, that the categories are text, cotext, context, intertext, and contextualization. I'm a former English major, so you'll see that they're all alliterative there. So let's start with text. And what I'll do is use two examples to try to explain what I'm getting at here. Let me flip up my image of Emanuel Leutz's 1850 painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware River. So I'll use this, and I'll also use an example from Mark chapter 11, verses 15 through 18, although I won't read that, but that's the account, 15 through 19. That's the account of Jesus making a demonstration in the temple of Jerusalem. Sometimes it's called the cleansing of the temple, although I personally think that heading is a little bit problematic. But anyway, I'll try to explain on the basis of both of these examples sort of what this paper is looking at. Let's start with text, and I'll start actually with the painting here. Let's imagine you were assigned in an art class to do a kind of discourse analysis of Leutz's painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware. But let's imagine in that particular assignment, you weren't looking at the entire painting, you were looking at a portion of it. Just as for an interpretive working paper, you won't look at the entire Gospel of Mark, but you might look at a smaller segment of it. And let's imagine that the portion that you were assigned for this paper in an art history class is the figure of George Washington himself. So that's your primary text, as it were. I hope that makes some sense. So if you were doing that kind of a discourse analysis with a painting like this, you would want to make a number of observations about what is happening or what is occurring in your primary text. To jump to the Markan example, maybe this will be a little bit more coherent. You would want to talk about the boundaries. Like you might be given the assignment that the text is Mark 11:15 through 19, and I think that makes sense as a division. But actually you could disagree. You might say, I think actually it goes through verse 20, or it starts earlier. How do you define the boundaries of your passage? What genre does your passage represent? Not just the larger genre of the Gospel of Mark, but specifically, is it a parable? Is it a healing story? Is it a letter? Is it a hymn embedded within a letter? Those are the kinds of questions that you would want to ask. Questions that are sort of narrowly focused on the text itself. That is, when I say the text, I mean specifically the pericope or the passage that you're assigned, like Mark 11:15 through 19, or John 4:1 through 40, or in the case of our artistic example, the figure of George Washington. You would want to make a number of examples sort of narrowly about that particular aspect of the painting. What is he wearing? What does his stance suggest? Where is he looking? Those kinds of things. Okay? So then in the next section, which is called cotext, you take a step back. You sort of take a wider angle view at a larger bit of material, which acknowledges that the interpretation of any particular passage in the Bible only makes sense in light of its larger whole. So you can't really understand what's going on in Mark 11 unless you understand something or some things about the entire Gospel of Mark. So the context is the larger literary context of your specific passage. I hope that makes sense. Not the whole Bible, but if you're assigned Philippians 4:10 through 20, the context is the letter to the Philippians. Okay, so here the context would be the entire painting of George Washington crossing the Delaware River. So in that sense, then you would want to make a number of observations, not just about the narrow confines of your particular text or the image of George Washington himself, but the bigger picture. How do you understand the depiction of Washington in light of what's going on around him, in light of what the other characters are doing? You'll notice that he's in a boat with other people. Who are those other people? What are they doing? How are they figured? How are they represented? What about the boats behind him? What about the landscape, the setting, those kinds of things? So in the same way, you would want to make a series of observations in the contextual section about the larger context of the book or the letter or the gospel narrative in which your particular passage makes sense. So, for example, Mark 11 is actually a good example. If you were assigned Mark 11:15 through 19, you can't actually really understand what Jesus does in the temple unless you read the bit before and the bit after, because this particular passage is an example of what is sometimes called a Markan sandwich, and that is where Mark has taken one episode and sort of split it in part or in two and inserted another story in the middle. So in chapter 11, immediately before verse 15, they enter Bethany and Jesus sees a fig tree in leaf that doesn't have any fruit on it, and when he gets to it, he curses it and he says, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again," which is kind of an odd episode, obviously. And then after the episode in the temple, in the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to him, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God," etc., etc. So there's something going on with the fig tree and Jesus' cursing of it that presumably sheds light on what happens in between. And in point of fact, this is not a lecture on Mark 11, but essentially I think the fig tree is a commentary on what's happening in the temple. Jesus is upset about the temple not producing the fruit that it ought to, thus his demonstration, and that is related to what he says and does to the fig tree. So that's a sort of an aside. But the point is, unless you paid attention to that surrounding context, or say to Jesus's relationship to the temple and temple authorities in the larger context of the Gospel of Mark, Mark 11:15 through 19 might not make much sense. I hope that's clear. The next section actually asks you to go out even wider and to look at context, by which I generally mean the larger historical context of your particular passage. So when you're looking at a text like Mark 11:15 through 19, what is the historical context of that particular episode? What can we say about the temple in Jerusalem and the way that it functioned, what people did there, what kinds of practices they engaged in when they went to the temple? You might ask questions about Jesus' relationship to the temple authorities and who the temple authorities were and what they did. So there you're thinking about the larger historical context. In the same way, you might ask questions with regard to Leutz's painting about the context that's recorded in the painting. What happened on December 25th and 26th, 1776, that caused George Washington to lead his troops across the Delaware River? You might make a series of observations about what we call the Revolutionary War here in the United States, and about the context of Washington's particular military action as it's recorded here. But interestingly, and this is not unrelated to the Gospels, you might also make a series of observations or ask questions about the context, the historical context in which the painting was created. And that's an interesting question in its own right. So that would reflect a sort of second level, and I think you see this in the Gospels as well. On the one hand, there's the painting itself and the context that it represents, but of course, Leutz's painting was created in 1850, many years after the original episode, and there's something happening there in that historical context that sheds light on the painting as well. Not to get too deep into it, but Leutz himself was sympathetic to a number of revolutionary movements that spread throughout Europe in the middle part of the 19th century. 1848 is sometimes called the Spring of the People, or the Year of Revolution, because there were a number of democratic movements and revolutions throughout Europe in the year 1848 and following. And Leutz, when he painted this particular painting, was in some ways trying to, he was actually German, had been raised in America, came back to Germany, and was essentially using this particular image to support political movements toward freedom and democracy in Europe in his own context. So there you see an interesting example of this painting having sort of two levels of historical context. And we can say the same thing about the Gospels. Whatever we think about when the Gospels were written, which of course is a complicated question, Mark's Gospel tells us certain things about what happened in Jesus' lifetime, but it also says something or some things about what was happening in and for the Christ-following movement at the time Mark's Gospel was written. There's, for example, that aside in Mark chapter 14 when Jesus describes the abomination of desolation, and there's a parenthetical statement that says, "Let the reader understand." So there the author is telling us, or telling his audience, that what Jesus said and did back then has significance for our context today. So the Gospel of Matthew, for example, tells the story of Jesus on one level, but at the same time, it's also communicating certain things about what's happening in Matthew's group or to Matthew's group at the time the Gospel was written. Those are all historical, contextual questions. Next is what we call intertext, and specifically, maybe primarily, that is the use of tradition. In Mark 11:15 through 19, Jesus cites, he says in verse 17, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers." Which, of course, cites directly Isaiah 56 and Jeremiah 7. So there's a very clear example of an intertextual citation. Jesus is drawing upon these Old Testament passages to make a point. So in the intertextual section, especially if there is a citation or even an allusion to the Old Testament or some other text, you'll want to reflect on that or think about that. What is the purpose of this citation? What is it doing rhetorically? How does it function in the discourse? What is its contribution to the narrative or to the point that's being made? Those are questions that you might consider, as well as, does the author who's citing the text seem to be aware of or considerate of the larger context in the Old Testament from which this smaller portion is taken? Or is the text simply capitalizing on some keywords or a particular statement to make a point? Those are things that you might consider in the intertextual section. If you're talking about this particular painting, you might I don't actually know quite enough history to know about I don't know quite enough art history to know about all the influences of Emanuel Leutz. I know he was part of something called the Dusseldorf School. So you might imagine, are there intertextual connections? Is he drawing on figures from the past? There's a famous painting from, I think, 1805 of Napoleon crossing the Swiss Alps. So is he drawing upon earlier figuration of conquering military figures to depict his image of Washington, those sorts of things. And then finally, contextualization. And that, of course, is and potentially quite broad. That's asking questions about how you would appropriate this particular text in light of your own context, or in light of the church's larger historical context and confessions. Contextualizing means essentially, what does a faithful reading of this text look like in your particular context? So, of course, people from various contexts have various ways of answering those sorts of questions, and I'm always eager to learn how students reflect critically on their own context and how a particular Bible passage makes sense in light of that context, or challenges that context, reconfigures that context, shapes that context. So how I will read Mark 11:15 through 19 in light of my own denominational affiliation, my own gender, ethnicity, nationality, will in many ways shape what I see in the passage. And so what this final section is asking you to do is to reflect critically and self-consciously on your own context and what the passage looks like for you. So, for example, with regard to Mark 15 through 19, I'm very interested in economic questions. I always have been. That's been central to much of my research. So I read this particular episode not as a cleansing, but as an act of protest against the way that the temple has served the wealthy and abused and acted unjustly against the poor. I recognize that comes out of a certain set of convictions about Scripture and the function of Scripture, and that other people might read that text very differently and see a different sort of dynamic at play. So this section asks you to reflect contextually on the passage in light of the other sorts of things that you've observed or noticed or asked about throughout the paper. To go to the example here, presumably someone who considers himself or herself American will have a very different response to this particular image than someone who considers himself or herself British. So, or you could reflect on the legacy of Washington, his presidency. There's a sort of a host of things that you could do, but of course this is not a class on the interpretation of paintings, but a class on the New Testament. So I'll stop there with regard to my analogy. I hope this was helpful, just in terms of explaining the sort of basics of what we're looking for you to do in this particular assignment. Again, if you have questions about it, please post them in the Q&A section of the class so that I can respond as quickly and helpfully as I can, and that my responses then hopefully maybe will be helpful to others in the class as well. So I look forward to, of course, reading your papers in a couple of weeks, and I will also be eager to answer any questions that you might have. Thanks.